This is Damon Fordham, author, historian, and adjunct professor at the Citadel and Charleston Southern University in Charleston, South Carolina. This morning, I'm going to talk to you about a book that was written by the great Zora Neale Hurston, the African-American writer who lived from 1891 till 1960, and who chronicled the folk tales and history and customs and practices of her people. In 1927, she interviewed a fascinating man by the name of Cudjo Lewis, who was also known by his birth name of Kosula. Kosula, as a matter of fact, was his Nigerian name. He was born in Nigeria sometime in the early 1840s. And in 1859 or 1860, there was an American slave ship captain by the name of Timothy Meagher, who had a boat called the Clotilda, which captured Kosula as well as 160 or so of his comrades in modern day Nigeria. And these people were believed to have been the last slave ship brought to America. They landed in Mobile, Alabama. Anyway, several people had written about his story before. A lady by the name of Emma Roche wrote about him in a book about slave history in Alabama in 1914. And Arthur Fawcett wrote captured some of his folk tales in the Journal of American Folklore also in 1927. So Zora Neale Hurston interviewed him for the Journal of Negro History, and that led to what happens next. She took some of those interviews as well as her conversations with him about his life, both coming from Africa as well as to Mobile, in this book called Barracoon, which was originally written in 1931, but was not published until May of 2018. Anyway, I got the book the day that it first came out on May the 8th of 2018. Today is the May the 12th. Finished reading it, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about it. Now, this book begins with Zora Neale Hurston visiting Cudjo Lewis, and she chooses to call him by his birth name Kosula. And that means a lot to him because even though at the time of this interview, he was well into his 80s, he told Zora Neale Hurston that the main thing that he wanted was for his people back in Nigeria to know where he was, and hopefully he would one day eventually get to see them and such. It's a very powerful plea and pretty poignant too. But anyway, the story goes something like this. The book is really fascinating because in the midst of his conversations with Zora Neale Hurston, she goes over to his place and they share such crops as peaches and watermelon, and she brings him pipe tobacco as well as insect repellent and various other such things. And they relax and they converse in this very pastoral environment where he chops wood for his little home and such, as well as takes care of his crops, and they spend a lot of very pleasant time together. And he begins to tell her these fascinating stories about life in Nigeria in the 1850s. As a boy, he goes through manhood initiation ceremonies and he trains to be a warrior. And he talks about the songs that they sang and the stories that they told and their customs and all of that. And it reads almost like a very good adventure novel. It makes for very fascinating reading to learn about these people and their way of life at that time, because so often we get a lot of nonsense about what history in West Africa was like, and it's good to get this perspective from somebody who was actually there at the time, firsthand. So then he gets into this really deep narrative about how the king of nearby Dahomey invades their kingdom, and as well as how they go through this war with them, which leads to his enslavement. And an interesting part about that story is about the Mino. The Mino essentially were these female Amazon warriors of the Dahomey people, who were known as the Amazon, they were basically known as the Dahomey warriors by the Europeans. But as I mentioned before, they were known as the Mino, in Dahomey, which means our mothers. Now, very recently, there's been this movie called Black Panther. And it is said that these Mino, or the Dahomey warriors, these lady warriors, were actually the inspiration for the lady warriors who were in the movie Black Panther. Funny how all this connects, doesn't it? But anyway, he gets into how these people captured them, and they put them in barracoons, which is where the book gets its title, which essentially are these slave pens where these people are put until Timothy Meagher comes by in his slave ship, the Clotilda, and takes them to Mobile, Alabama, where they go into slavery. Now, about Timothy Meagher, I should say this. You see, by 1859, it was illegal to actually capture people from Africa and put them into slavery. But the transcontinental slave trade had ended, at least for the United States, legally on paper in 1808. But slavery continued because it was a source of major income from the southern United States at that point. So Timothy Meagher felt that he could get away with it by breaking the law and taking these people over in slavery to southern Alabama. And as a matter of fact, he did get away with it. But the point is, though, he writes about Kosula, or Cujo Lewis, tells all of this stuff in such a fascinating manner that you just cannot put this book down the way he tells it and the way Zora Neale Hurston writes it. It's an excellent, both as adventure and as a history lesson and as a drama of the incomparable human spirit. It's really good reading. So from that, he goes into describing how they all managed to end up in Mobile, Alabama, where they are enslaved for about 5 years. And he relates to his adventures in freedom, about what happened when they tried to vote, what happened with his wife and children, and so forth. And throughout the book, he explains things through these wise proverbs and stories to get his point across. And you don't hear about that type of thing anymore from older people now. So, at least for the most part. So anyway, the book pretty much ends with his last interview with Zora Neale Hurston. But it doesn't really talk a whole lot of detail about the rest of Kusola's story. Now, if you want to learn more about his story after what happened after he was interviewed by Zora Neale Hurston, there's this book called Dreams of Africa and Alabama by Sylviane Diouf. See, this is Cujo Lewis with his twin great-granddaughters, Mary and Martha. And this book came out back in 2007. And it kind of tells the rest of the story and gives a more academic version of the story of the other Africans that came over aboard the boat Clotilda and such. But in either case, though, the book Barracoon is a real treasure, and not just for the reasons that I've just given. You see, right now, it's no secret if I tell you that we're living in times that are greatly lacking in wisdom. Conspiracy theories passed off as fact, bad leadership passing off as good leadership, mass confusion among the people with very few people offering constructive solutions. And Cujo Lewis, aka Kosula, he was one of that, if you were about my age or older, you probably had the good experience of sitting down with these wise elders who may not have had a whole lot of education, but they had the life experiences and they explained things in stories and proverbs, and they kept you so fascinated that you didn't mind not watching television or not reading a comic book and just sitting there and listening to them. And sadly, for the most part, that generation has passed away, and the generation who didn't have time to listen to them are largely our elders today, unfortunately. So in these times that abound with confusion and hatred and madness, that it really kind of does us good to sit back and listen to what these wise elders had to say and how they managed to get through what they went through in their day could give us a lot of advice on how to get through what we're going through today. So with that being said, my name is Damon Fordham, and I strongly recommend that you read Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston to learn this wonderful story about the great Mr. Cujo Lewis. And if you want to learn in more academic detail about him and his adventures, I would recommend that you read Sylviane A. Diop's Dreams of Africa in Alabama, that tells the rest of his story. And on a final note, the descendants of Cujo Lewis and many of the other Africans brought over by the Cotilda are still living today in Mobile, Alabama, in a place that is known as Africatown, that was basically built and set off by Kosula and the rest of his kinfolk and descendants. And recently, Dr. Henry Louis Gates on his show, Finding Your Roots, interviewed Questlove, the drummer for the Roots, the popular band The Roots. And Questlove, incidentally, is a descendant of some of these very people. As I said, it's amazing how a lot of this connects. With that being said, this is Damon Fordham talking about this great book called Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston.